The Duke collapsed at the chapel door, after seeing who signed her marriage petition. Chapter 1. I have learned that the dead do not stay silent, not when they have unfinished business with the living. And on the morning I walked into St. Dunstan's chapel with nothing but desperation in my heart, I discovered that my brother's ghost had been waiting for me all along. My name is Eliza Ashford, and for 5 years I have lived as a woman in mourning, though no body was ever found, no grave ever dug, no funeral ever held. My brother Thomas vanished on the eve of his wedding, and with him vanished every protection I had ever known. Our parents had died when I was 16, leaving Thomas as my guardian, my champion, my only family. When he disappeared, I was handed like an unwanted parcel to my uncle, Lord Bertram Ashford, a man who viewed me not as a niece, but as an asset to be liquidated at the most opportune moment. That moment, it seemed, had finally arrived. I remember the evening my fate was sealed with the clarity of a knife wound. It was late November, and the London fog pressed against the windows of my uncle's townhouse like a living thing, hungry and patient. I sat in the drawing room, pretending to read, while my uncle entertained a guest in his study. I could hear the low murmur of masculine voices, the clink of brandy glasses, the occasional bark of laughter that held no warmth. When the study door opened and my uncle called my name, I knew before I rose from my chair that something terrible was about to happen. The man standing beside my uncle was Viscount Hartley, a name whispered in drawing rooms with equal parts fascination and revulsion. He was perhaps 40 years old, with the kind of handsome face that had long since been corrupted by cruelty and excess. His eyes moved over me the way a butcher examines a cut of meat, calculating, assessing, utterly devoid of human feeling. I felt my skin crawl beneath my modest gray gown. My uncle announced the engagement as though he were discussing a business transaction, which of course he was. The Viscount's debts were legendary, and my dowry, held in trust until my marriage, was substantial enough to clear them and leave him comfortable for years. In exchange, my uncle would receive certain considerations, political favors, social connections. I was not consulted, I was not asked. I was simply informed that I would become Viscountess Hartley within the month, and that I should be grateful for such an advantageous match. I stood there in the amber lamplight, my hands clasped so tightly that my knuckles ached, and I thought of all the stories I had heard about Viscount Hartley. The young maid who had thrown herself into the Thames rather than return to his household. The first wife who had died of a mysterious illness within a year of their marriage. The whispers of locked rooms and screams in the night. And I understood with perfect, crystalline clarity that if I married this man, I would not survive. I retired to my room that night without supper, pleading a headache, and I sat at my window watching the fog swallow the street lamps one by one. I had no money of my own, no friends with the power to help me, no legal standing to refuse. Under the law, I was my uncle's property until I became my husband's property, and there was nothing I could do to change that. I pressed my forehead against the cold glass and allowed myself, for the first time in years, to weep. It was then that I noticed the letter. It had been slipped beneath my door so silently that I had not heard it arrive. The envelope was plain, unmarked, addressed only with my Christian name and handwriting I did not recognize. Inside was a single sheet of paper, and as I read the words written there, my tears stopped, and my heart began to pound with something I had almost forgotten how to feel: hope. The letter was brief and unsigned. It instructed me to go to St. Dunstan's chapel in the east of the city at dawn, alone. It promised that I would find there the means to free myself from my uncle's control. And it concluded with a phrase that made my blood run cold and then hot again, a phrase that echoed in my mind for the rest of that sleepless night. Your brother keeps his promises. I did not sleep. I could not. I sat in my room as the hours crept past, my mind racing through possibilities and impossibilities. Thomas had been declared dead by the courts 3 years after his disappearance. a necessary legal fiction that had allowed my uncle to assume control of the family assets. But no body had ever been found. No witness had ever come forward. Thomas had simply walked out of our house one evening and vanished into the London fog, leaving behind only questions and a sister who refused to believe he was gone. I had spent years searching for him, hiring investigators, following rumors, chasing shadows. Every lead had ended in disappointment. Every hope had been crushed. And yet I had never been able to accept that Thomas was dead, not truly, not in the deepest chambers of my heart. He had been so vital, so alive, so determined to protect me from the very fate that now awaited me. How could such a force simply cease to exist? The letter could be a trap. I knew that. It could be some cruel hoax designed to exploit my grief. It could be a scheme by my uncle to test my loyalty, or by Viscount Hartley to demonstrate my worthlessness as a bride. But as I sat there in the darkness, watching the first gray light of dawn begin to seep through the fog, I realized that it did not matter. I had nothing left to lose. If there was even the smallest chance that this letter contained truth, I had to follow it. And if it led me into danger, then at least I would face that danger on my own terms, rather than submitting meekly to the slow destruction that awaited me as Hartley's wife. I dressed carefully in my plainest clothes, a dark blue traveling dress that would attract no attention, a heavy cloak with a hood to hide my face. I slipped out of my room while the household still slept, moving through the silent corridors with the practiced stealth of a woman who had learned to make herself invisible. The servants' entrance opened without a sound, and then I was outside, breathing the cold, damp air of a London morning, free for the first time in longer than I could remember. St. Dunstan's Chapel stood in a part of the city I had never visited, a cramped and ancient neighborhood where the streets twisted back upon themselves like the coils of a snake. The fog was thick here, muffling sound and swallowing light, and I walked through it as though through a dream, my footsteps echoing on cobblestones that were slick with moisture. The chapel itself was small and forgotten, wedged between a shuttered warehouse and a row of tenements that leaned against each other like exhausted soldiers. Its stone walls were black, with centuries of soot, and its single stained glass window was so dark with grime that no light could pass through it. The door was unlocked. I pushed it open and stepped inside, and for a moment I could see nothing at all. The interior was cold and still, smelling of dust and candle wax and something else, something faintly sweet that I could not identify. As my eyes adjusted to the dimness, I made out rows of empty pews, an altar draped in moth-eaten cloth, and on that altar a single object that caught the weak light filtering through the window. It was a document, a legal document, folded and sealed and waiting for me as though it had been placed there by invisible hands. I walked toward it slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs, my breath coming in shallow gasps that formed small clouds in the frigid air. When I reached the altar, I picked up the document with trembling fingers and broke the seal. It was a marriage petition, the kind that must be filed with the church and approved by a woman's guardian before any wedding can take place. And there, at the bottom of the page, written in handwriting I knew as well as my own, was the signature of Thomas Ashford. The date beside the signature was yesterday. I stared at those words until they blurred before my eyes. This was impossible. Thomas was dead, or missing, or lost somewhere beyond my reach. He could not have signed this document yesterday. He could not have known about my engagement, about my desperation, about the trap that was closing around me. And yet, here was his signature, the distinctive flourish on the capital T, the way the final D trailed off into a thin line. I had seen that signature on hundreds of documents during the years when Thomas managed our family's affairs. I would have recognized it anywhere. My hands were shaking so badly that the paper rattled. I did not understand what I was holding or how it had come to be here. I only knew that this document, if it was genuine, if it could be authenticated, would give me a way out. A guardian's signature on a marriage petition superseded any other arrangement. If Thomas was alive, if he had signed this, then my uncle's contract with Viscount Hartley was void. I would be free. I clutched the petition to my chest and closed my eyes, and for one brief, shining moment, I allowed myself to believe that everything would be all right. That was when I heard the chapel door open behind me. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat, and found myself staring at a figure silhouetted against the gray light of morning. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in the impeccable black of a gentleman in mourning. For one wild, impossible second, I thought it was Thomas, that he had finally returned to me, that this nightmare was about to end. But then the figure stepped forward, and the dim light fell upon his face, and I recognized him with a shock of horror that nearly drove me to my knees. It was Adrian Vane, the Duke of Ravensford. I had not seen him in 5 years, not since the night of the ball where Thomas's engagement to him had been announced. I had been 19 then, young and naive, and still believing that the world was essentially kind. I remembered watching the Duke from across the ballroom, this cold and beautiful man who was to become my brother's connection to one of the most powerful families in England. Thomas had explained that the marriage was political, a strategic alliance that would benefit both houses, but I had seen the way the Duke looked at my brother, with a possessiveness that bordered on obsession, and I had felt a chill run down my spine. The engagement, of course, had never been completed. Thomas had vanished that very night, leaving the Duke standing at the altar of his family chapel, humiliated before all of London society. The scandal had been immense. The Duke had retreated to his country estate and had rarely been seen in society since. But the rumors had never stopped. Some said he had gone mad with rage. Others whispered that he had hired men to hunt Thomas down, to make him pay for the insult. And a few, speaking in voices barely above a breath, suggested that the Duke himself knew exactly what had happened to Thomas Ashford, because the Duke himself had made it happen. Now he stood before me in this forgotten chapel, his face pale as marble, his dark eyes fixed on the document I held against my chest. I watched those eyes travel from my face to the petition and back again, and I saw something flicker in their depths, something that looked almost like recognition. And then, without warning, he took 3 steps forward, reached out, and snatched the document from my hands. I cried out in protest, but he was not listening. He held the petition up to the weak light, his eyes scanning the page with an intensity that frightened me. When he reached the signature at the bottom, he went absolutely still. The color drained from his face until he was whiter than the fog outside. His hands began to tremble, a fine, almost imperceptible shaking that spread up his arms and into his shoulders. "I demand you return that document to me," I said, forcing my voice to remain steady. "It does not belong to you." He did not respond. He did not even seem to hear me. His eyes remained fixed on that signature, on those familiar loops and flourishes, and I watched as his expression shifted from shock to disbelief to something else entirely, something that looked like naked, overwhelming terror. "This is not possible," he whispered. His voice was hoarse, cracked, as though he had not spoken in days. "This cannot be possible." I took a step toward him, emboldened by his obvious distress. "I do not know what business you have here, Your Grace, but that petition was left for me. My brother signed it, and I intend to use it to free myself from an unwanted engagement." At the word brother, the Duke flinched as though I had struck him. He looked up from the document, and for the first time our eyes truly met. I saw depths in his gaze that I could not fathom, layers of guilt and grief and something that almost resembled longing. He opened his mouth as though to speak, but no words came out. He swayed on his feet, reaching out blindly for the edge of a pew to steady himself. "Your brother," he repeated. His voice was barely audible now, a ragged whisper that seemed to cost him enormous effort. "Thomas Ashford." "Yes," I said. "My brother Thomas, the man you were supposed to marry, the man who disappeared 5 years ago without a trace. He signed this petition yesterday, Your Grace, which means he is alive, which means that everything we believed, everything you believed, was wrong. The Duke stared at me for a long moment, and I watched something shatter behind his eyes. It was as though a mask he had been wearing for years had suddenly cracked and fallen away, revealing the ravaged landscape beneath. When he spoke again, his voice was thick with an emotion I could not name. "I know that handwriting," he said. "I know it as well as I know my own. I have studied it, traced it, dreamed of it for 5 years." He lifted the petition again, his hands shaking violently now. But Thomas Ashford could not have written this. He could not have signed this document yesterday. "Why not?" I demanded. "Because you believed him dead? Because you gave up hope?" "I never gave up hope, Your Grace. I always knew." The Duke shook his head slowly, and when he looked at me again, there were tears in his eyes. Tears on the face of the coldest, most controlled man I had ever known. It made my blood run cold. "You do not understand," he said. His voice broke on the words. Thomas Ashford could not have signed this petition because Thomas Ashford cannot write. He cannot hold a pen. He cannot form letters. He has not been able to do so for 5 years, not since the night I destroyed his hands. The words hung in the cold air of the chapel like a curse. I heard them, but I could not comprehend them. My mind refused to assemble them into meaning. I stared at the Duke, at this man who stood before me confessing to something monstrous, and I felt the ground shift beneath my feet. "What did you say?" I whispered. But the Duke did not answer. His eyes rolled back in his head, his knees buckled, and he collapsed at the chapel door like a man struck down by the hand of God himself. The petition fluttered from his fingers and settled on the stone floor beside him, that impossible signature facing upward, accusing and undeniable. I stood frozen in place, unable to move, unable to think, unable to do anything but stare at the crumpled form of the Duke of Ravensford and the document that lay beside him. My brother's signature, my brother's handwriting, and the Duke's terrible confession echoing in my ears, telling me that Thomas could not have written those words, could not have held a pen, could not have done anything at all since the night this man had destroyed his hands. The fog pressed against the chapel windows, the candles on the altar guttered and swayed, and somewhere in the depths of the city, a church bell began to toll the hour, each strike reverberating through my chest like the beating of a second heart. I did not know what had happened to my brother. I did not know how his signature had appeared on that petition. I did not know if the man lying unconscious at my feet was a murderer, a madman, or something else entirely. But I knew, with a certainty that settled into my bones like ice, that I could not walk away from this chapel until I had answers. I knelt beside the Duke and pressed my fingers to his throat. His pulse was strong, his breathing steady. He had merely fainted, overcome by whatever demons his confession had unleashed. I looked at his face, so pale and vulnerable in unconsciousness, and I felt something stir in my chest that I did not want to examine too closely. He was beautiful, even now. Perhaps especially now, with his guard down and his secrets spilling from his lips. Beautiful and terrible and broken in ways I was only beginning to understand. I retrieved the petition from the floor and tucked it safely inside my cloak. Then I sat back on my heels and waited for the Duke of Ravensford to wake so that he could tell me the rest of his story. Outside, the dawn continued to break over London, grey and cold and full of secrets. And I, Eliza Ashford, sat in that forgotten chapel beside the man who had destroyed my brother, and I felt the first threads of a new fate beginning to weave themselves around my heart. The Duke collapsed at the chapel door after seeing who signed her marriage petition. Chapter 2. He woke slowly, like a man dragging himself up from the depths of a dark sea. I watched his eyelids flutter, watched consciousness return to his features in increments, watched the moment when memory crashed back over him and his entire body went rigid with the weight of what he had confessed. I did not move from my position beside him. I did not speak. I simply waited, the petition tucked safely inside my cloak, my heart beating with a strange, cold steadiness that surprised me. I had expected to feel rage when I looked at this man, this duke who had admitted to maiming my brother. I had expected hatred, revulsion, the burning desire for vengeance. Instead, I felt only a vast and terrible curiosity. I needed to understand. Before I could decide what to do, I needed to know everything. The Duke pushed himself up onto one elbow, wincing as though the movement caused him pain. His dark eyes found mine, and I saw the moment when he remembered who I was and what he had told me. Something shifted in his expression, a resignation that spoke of years spent carrying an unbearable burden. "You are still here," he said. His voice was rough, stripped of all pretense. "Did you expect me to run? I expected you to call for the constables. I expected you to flee this place and tell the world what manner of monster the Duke of Ravensford truly is." He sat up fully, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "I would not have blamed you." I rose to my feet and looked down at him. This powerful man who sat on the cold stone floor of a forgotten chapel, undone by the sight of a signature. "I need to understand," I said. "Before I decide what to do, I need to know what happened. All of it. From the beginning." The Duke was silent for a long moment. I could see the conflict playing across his features, the warring impulses to confess and to conceal. Finally, he nodded once and pulled himself up onto the nearest pew, gesturing for me to sit across from him. His movements were slow, deliberate, like those of a man who has been wounded and has not yet fully healed. "I loved your brother," he said. The words fell into the silence of the chapel like stones dropped into still water. I loved him with a desperation that I did not know I was capable of feeling. Our engagement was arranged by our families, yes, but for me, it was never about politics or alliances. From the moment I met Thomas, I was lost. I sat down slowly, my hands folded in my lap, my eyes never leaving his face. I had not expected this. I had expected cruelty, possessiveness, obsession of the darkest kind. But the way he spoke my brother's name, with such tenderness, such raw and painful longing, made something shift in my understanding of the man before me. Thomas did not feel the same, I said. It was not a question. I remembered how my brother had spoken of the engagement, with resignation rather than enthusiasm, with duty rather than joy. The Duke's lips curved into a bitter smile. Thomas was kind to me. He was always kind. But his heart belonged to someone else, someone he could never have, someone whose name he never told me, but whose shadow I could feel between us whenever we were together. I told myself it did not matter. I told myself that in time he would come to care for me as I cared for him. I was arrogant enough to believe that my love could be enough for both of us. He paused, staring at the dusty floor, his hands clasped so tightly that his knuckles were white. On the night before our wedding, I followed him. I had noticed him slipping away from the house at odd hours, noticed the distracted look in his eyes, the way he seemed to be listening for something I could not hear. I was jealous and afraid, and utterly convinced that he was meeting his secret love, preparing to abandon me at the altar. "What did you find?" I asked softly. The Duke lifted his head, and I saw that his eyes were bright with unshed tears. I found him in a laboratory, a hidden place in the basement of an abandoned building near the docks. He was not meeting a lover. He was meeting a scientist, a man named Dr. Erasmus Thorne. A man whose name is spoken only in whispers among those who dabble in the darkest reaches of human knowledge. I felt a chill run down my spine. I had heard that name before, in fragments of conversation I had overheard during my years of searching for Thomas. Dr. Thorne was a legend among the spiritualists and the scientists who sought to push beyond the boundaries of natural law. Some said he had discovered the secret of prolonging life. Others claimed he could extract memories from the living brain and preserve them like specimens in a jar. Most dismissed him as a charlatan or a madman. But a very few, spoke of him with a fear that suggested they knew something the others did not. "What was Thomas doing with this man?" I asked. The Duke shook his head slowly. "I did not understand it then, and I am not certain I understand it now. But Thomas was obsessed with something, some experiment that Dr. Thorne was conducting. He spoke of it with a fervor I had never seen in him before, as though it were the most important thing in the world. When I confronted him, when I demanded to know what he was doing, he tried to explain, but his words made no sense to me. He spoke of consciousness and memory, of the barriers between life and death, of finding a way to preserve the essence of a person beyond the decay of the flesh." I stared at him, my mind reeling. This was not the Thomas I remembered. My brother had been practical, grounded, devoted to the management of our family's affairs. He had never shown any interest in the occult or the scientific fringe. And yet, as I thought back to those final months before his disappearance, I began to remember small things I had dismissed at the time. Books on mesmerism and spiritualism appearing in his study. Long absences he explained away with vague mentions of business. A restlessness in his manner, a distraction in his gaze, as though part of him was always somewhere else. "What happened next?" I asked. My voice was barely above a whisper. The Duke's hands began to tremble again. "I lost my temper," he said. "I was jealous and hurt, and I did not understand. I accused Thomas of betraying me, of choosing this madman and his experiments over our future together. We argued. It became violent." He drew a shuddering breath. "Thomas tried to show me something, some device that Dr. Thorne had created. He said it would help me understand, that once I saw what they were working on, I would forgive him. But I did not want to understand. I wanted him to choose me. And when he reached for the device, He stopped. His face had gone gray, and I could see the pulse jumping in his throat. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. "You what?" I pressed. I needed to hear it. I needed him to say it. "I grabbed his hands," the Duke whispered. "I tried to pull him away from the machine, but something went wrong. There was a surge of energy, a light so bright it blinded me, and then Thomas was screaming. When I could see again, his hands were. His voice broke. They were ruined, burned beyond recognition. The flesh was blackened, the bones exposed in places. And Dr. Thorne was shouting at me to leave, to get out, that I had destroyed everything. I sat perfectly still, absorbing his words. The horror of what he described washed over me, but beneath it, I felt something else stirring. Not forgiveness, not yet, perhaps not ever, but something that might have been understanding. He had not set out to harm Thomas. He had not intended to maim him. He had acted out of jealousy and fear, and in doing so, he had triggered a catastrophe that had haunted him ever since. "Did Thomas survive?" I asked. The Duke nodded slowly. Dr. Thorne took him away. He said he could help him, could heal him, could use his science to repair what had been done. He told me to leave London, to tell no one what I had seen, to pretend that Thomas had simply vanished. He said that if I spoke of what had happened, he would ensure that I was destroyed, that every secret I had ever kept would be exposed to the world. "And you obeyed him," I said. There was no accusation in my voice, only a weary recognition of the truth. "You let the world believe Thomas was dead." The Duke lifted his haunted eyes to mine. What choice did I have? I had destroyed the man I loved. I had ruined his hands, his life, his future. Dr. Thorne promised he could help him, and I was too much of a coward to face what I had done, too afraid of the scandal, too desperate to believe that somehow Thomas might be healed and might someday forgive me. I rose from the pew and walked to the altar, my back to the Duke, my thoughts churning. Everything I had believed about my brother's disappearance was wrong. Thomas had not been killed or kidnapped. He had been injured in a terrible accident and then hidden away by a man who practiced science at the very edge of what was possible. For 5 years, he had been somewhere in this city, alive but unreachable, while I searched and grieved and slowly lost hope. "But the petition," I said, turning to face the Duke again. I pulled the document from my cloak and held it up. "Thomas signed this yesterday. His signature, his handwriting. You said yourself that you recognized it. If his hands were destroyed, how could he have written this?" The Duke stared at the petition, and I saw the terror return to his eyes. "That is what I do not understand," he said. "That is what made me collapse. Because you are right. That is Thomas's handwriting, exactly as I remember it. But his hands were burned beyond any possibility of recovery. Even Dr. Thorne could not have healed damage that severe, not through any natural means." "Then how?" I demanded. The Duke rose from the pew and crossed to where I stood, close enough that I could feel the heat of his body, close enough that I could see the fine lines of suffering etched around his eyes. He took the petition from my hands, his fingers brushing against mine, and I felt a spark of something that had no place in this moment, a sudden, unwanted awareness of his presence, of the masculine scent of him, of the way his dark gaze seemed to pull at something deep within me. "There are only 2 possibilities," he said, his voice low and intense. "Either Dr. Thorne found a way to heal Thomas's hands completely, which would be a miracle beyond anything science has ever achieved, or what?" He met my eyes, and in his gaze I saw a fear that matched my own. "Or Thomas is not the one who signed this petition. Someone else wrote these words, someone who can replicate his handwriting perfectly. And if that is the case, then we are being manipulated by forces we do not understand, led into a trap that we cannot see." I wanted to argue, to insist that the signature was genuine, that my brother was alive and reaching out to me. But the doubt the Duke had planted was taking root. Who would benefit from forging Thomas's signature? Who would know his handwriting well enough to replicate it so perfectly? And why bring me here, to this forgotten chapel, where the Duke of Ravensford would inevitably follow? "You knew I would be here," I said slowly. "How?" The Duke's expression flickered with something that might have been shame. "I received a letter as well. Anonymous, like yours, I presume. It told me to come to this chapel at dawn if I wanted answers about Thomas Ashford's fate. I have received such letters before, over the years. They always lead nowhere. But I cannot stop following them. I cannot stop hoping that somehow I might find him, might atone for what I did." I studied his face, searching for deception and finding only raw, wounded honesty. "Someone brought us both here," I said. "Someone who knew we would both come. Someone who wanted us to meet." "Yes." "Why?" The Duke shook his head. "I do not know, but I intend to find out." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed, becoming more formal, more controlled. "Miss Ashford, I have no right to ask anything of you. I have no right even to speak to you, given what I have done to your family. But I believe that we are caught in the same web, you and I believe that our best chance of finding the truth is to work together." I stared at him, this man who had confessed to maiming my brother, this man whose very presence should have filled me with revulsion. But as I looked into his eyes, I saw something I had not expected. I saw a man who had been destroyed by his own guilt, who had spent 5 years in a prison of his own making, who wanted redemption so desperately that he was willing to bare his darkest secrets to the sister of the man he had wronged. And I saw something else, something that frightened me far more than his confession. I saw a reflection of my own loneliness, my own grief, my own desperate need to find meaning in the wreckage of my life. I saw a man who understood what it was to lose everything and to keep going anyway. "You destroyed my brother's hands," I said quietly. "You may have destroyed his entire life. And you want me to trust you?" "No," he said. "I want you to use me. I have resources, connections, investigators who answer only to me. I have spent 5 years searching for Thomas, trying to find him, trying to make amends. I have learned things about Dr. Thorne, about his laboratory, about his network of associates. I will share all of it with you, hold nothing back. And in return, I ask only that you allow me to help you find the truth." I thought of my uncle, waiting for me to return so he could hand me over to Viscount Hartley. I thought of the life that awaited me if I went back, the slow destruction of everything I was. And I thought of Thomas, my beloved brother, alive somewhere in this city, reaching out to me through a signature that should have been impossible. "Very well," I said. "But understand this, Your Grace. I do not forgive you. I may never forgive you. And if I learn that you have lied to me, that you have kept anything from me, I will destroy you without hesitation." The Duke nodded, and something that might have been respect flickered in his eyes. I would expect nothing less. We left the chapel together, stepping out into a London morning that had grown brighter, but no less cold. The fog had begun to lift, revealing glimpses of pale blue sky between the rooftops. I pulled my cloak tighter around my shoulders and tucked the petition safely against my chest. Somewhere in this city, my brother waited. Somewhere, the truth about his disappearance lay hidden, guarded by a scientist who dealt in memories and miracles. And beside me walked the man who had destroyed him, the man who might yet prove to be my greatest ally or my most dangerous enemy. I did not know which. I knew only that our fates had become intertwined in that forgotten chapel, bound together by a signature that defied explanation and a mystery that demanded to be solved. As we walked, our shoulders nearly touching, I felt the Duke's presence like a physical weight at my side. I told myself that the awareness humming through my body was merely caution, merely the heightened alertness of a woman in the company of a dangerous man. I told myself that the warmth spreading through my chest when he looked at me was simply the residual shock of everything I had learned. I was lying, of course. Even then, in that very first hour of our strange alliance, I knew that something far more treacherous than guilt or grief was beginning to stir between us. And I knew that before this was over, I would have to choose between the brother I was searching for and the man who had destroyed him. But that choice lay ahead of me still, hidden in the fog of an uncertain future. For now, there was only the next step, and the next, and the dawning realization that nothing in my life would ever be the same again. The Duke collapsed at the chapel door. After seeing who signed her marriage petition, Chapter 3. The Duke's carriage waited at the end of the narrow street, black and gleaming, attended by a driver who asked no questions when his master appeared with a young woman at his side. I hesitated at the door, acutely aware of what it would mean if anyone saw me entering the private carriage of the Duke of Ravensford. My reputation, already fragile, would be destroyed beyond repair. As if reading my thoughts, the Duke spoke quietly beside me. "I can have my driver take you wherever you wish to go. You do not have to come with me." I looked at him, at this man who had just confessed to maiming my brother, and I made my choice. "Where are we going?" Something shifted in his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or relief. "To my townhouse. I have documents there, files I have compiled over the years. Everything I have learned about Dr. Thorne and his work. If we are to find your brother, we must start with what we know." I climbed into the carriage without another word. The Duke followed, settling onto the seat across from me, and as the vehicle lurched into motion, I became intensely aware of the intimacy of our situation. The curtains were drawn, the interior dim and close, and I could hear the steady rhythm of his breathing in the confined space. We rode in silence through streets that gradually grew wider and more elegant. I watched the Duke from beneath my lashes, studying the harsh lines of his profile, the way his hands gripped his knees as though he were holding himself together by sheer force of will. He was not what I had expected. The monster of my imagination had been cold and cruel, a man who destroyed without remorse. The reality was far more complicated. "You said you loved him," I said finally. The words came out before I could stop them. The Duke turned his head, his dark eyes meeting mine. "I did. I do. Even after everything, I have never stopped." "But you hurt him." He flinched as though I had struck him. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, staring at the curtained window. "I have asked myself 1,000 times how I could have done such a thing to someone I loved. The answer is always the same. I was afraid of losing him, and in my fear, I became the very thing I dreaded. I became someone he could not love. I thought of Thomas, of his gentle smile and his patient ways, of how he had always known exactly what to say to calm my fears. Had he ever loved anyone the way the Duke described? Had he carried a secret passion in his heart, hidden even from me?" "You said his heart belonged to someone else," I said. "Someone he could never have." "Do you know who it was?" The Duke shook his head. "He never told me, but I saw it in him, that particular kind of hopeless devotion that marks a person who loves without any expectation of return. I recognized it because I felt the same way about him." The carriage slowed and then stopped. Through the window, I glimpsed a grand facade of white stone, columns and tall windows that spoke of wealth and power. The Duke's townhouse, one of the finest addresses in London. I thought of my own cramped room in my uncle's house, the bars that were not visible but were no less real, and I felt a bitter twist of irony. Here I was, fleeing from one form of imprisonment into the domain of a man who might prove to be an even greater danger. We entered through a side door, avoiding the main entrance where servants might see and gossip. The Duke led me through hushed corridors lined with portraits of his ancestors, their painted eyes following us with silent judgment. Finally, we reached a study at the back of the house, a room lined with books and dominated by a massive desk covered in papers. "Everything I have learned is here," the Duke said, gesturing at the chaos of documents. "For 5 years, I have employed investigators, bribed informants, followed every lead no matter how faint. Dr. Thorne is a ghost. He moves constantly, never staying in one place for more than a few months. His laboratory near the docks was abandoned within days of the accident. Since then, I have tracked him to a dozen different locations, but he always vanishes before I can reach him." I moved to the desk and began examining the papers. There were maps marked with pins, lists of names and addresses, sketches of buildings and devices I did not recognize. But what caught my attention was a stack of letters tied with a black ribbon, their pages yellowed with age. "What are these?" I asked. "Letters," the Duke said. His voice had grown quieter. "Letters from people who claim to have encountered Dr. Thorne. Some are clearly mad or seeking money, but a few." He paused. "A few describe things that should not be possible." I untied the ribbon and began to read. The first letter was from a woman whose husband had suffered a terrible head injury. She wrote of seeking out Dr. Thorne in desperation, of watching him perform a procedure that seemed to draw something luminous from her husband's skull. When it was over, her husband could not remember his own name, but a device in Thorne's laboratory glowed with a soft blue light, and within that light, she swore she could see images of her husband's life playing out like scenes from a magic lantern show. The second letter was from a man whose daughter had died of consumption. He claimed that Dr. Thorne had offered to preserve her memories, to extract them from her dying brain and store them in a machine. The man had refused, horrified by the suggestion. But he wondered in his letter whether he had made a terrible mistake, whether some part of his daughter might have lived on if he had only been brave enough to accept. I set the letters down, my hands trembling. "This is madness," I whispered. "Is it?" The Duke moved to stand beside me, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. 5 years ago, I would have agreed with you, but I have seen things since then, Miss Ashford. I have met people who spoke of miracles and horrors beyond anything our science can explain. Dr. Thorne is not a charlatan. He is something far more dangerous. He is a man who has found a way to touch the very essence of what makes us human." "And Thomas was helping him," I said. "Thomas was part of this." "Yes. From what I have been able to gather, your brother became involved with Dr. Thorne approximately a year before our engagement. They were working on something together, some experiment that Thomas believed would change the world. He was providing funding, connections, protection from those who might interfere. I thought of my brother, the careful steward of our family's fortune, diverting resources to fund experiments in the extraction of human memory. It seemed impossible. And yet, the more I considered it, the more it made a terrible kind of sense. Thomas had always been fascinated by questions of identity and consciousness. He had once told me that he believed the soul was not something mystical, but something that could be studied, measured, understood. I had thought he was speaking philosophically. Now I wondered if he had been speaking literally. If Thomas was working with Dr. Thorne, I said slowly, then perhaps he knows where Thorne is now. Perhaps the petition was a message, a way of telling me that he is alive and ready to make contact. The Duke nodded. That is what I believe as well. But there is another possibility we must consider. What if the petition was not written by Thomas at all? What if someone else, someone with access to Dr. Thorne's technology, has found a way to replicate his handwriting? Why would anyone do that? To draw us out. The Duke's expression darkened. I have enemies, Miss Ashford. Men who would like nothing better than to see me destroyed. If they discovered what happened that night in the laboratory, they could use it against me. They could forge evidence, manipulate situations, create the appearance of a mystery that would lead me into a trap. I considered this, turning it over in my mind. But the petition does not harm you, I said. It helps me. It gives me a way to escape my uncle's control, to avoid an unwanted marriage, unless that too is part of the design. Unless someone wants you free of your uncle so they can use you for their own purposes. A chill ran down my spine. The web of possibilities was growing more tangled with every moment. I had come to this house seeking answers, and instead I had found only deeper questions. We need to find Dr. Thorne, I said. He is the key to all of this. If he is alive, if he knows where Thomas is, then everything else follows from that. I agree. The Duke moved to the desk and extracted a folder from beneath the pile of papers. 3 months ago, one of my investigators reported a sighting of a man matching Thorne's description in Whitechapel. The trail went cold before I could pursue it, but there was one detail that stood out. Thorne was seen entering a building that appeared to be abandoned from the outside, but which showed signs of electrical activity at night. Blue lights flickering in the upper windows. The same blue light described in the letters, I said. Precisely. The Duke handed me the folder. Inside was a sketch of a building, narrow and crooked, wedged between a tannery and a coal merchant's warehouse. The address was printed beneath in neat copperplate. I have not investigated in person because I feared that my presence would alert Thorne and drive him away. But you, I understand, I said. He does not know my face. I could approach without arousing suspicion. The Duke's expression shifted, and I saw something flicker in his eyes that looked almost like concern. It would be dangerous. Whitechapel is not a place for a lady, especially after dark. And if Thorne is there, if he realizes why you have come, there is no telling what he might do. I met his gaze steadily. 5 years ago, I had a brother who protected me from every danger. Now I have nothing and no one. If there is a chance, however small, that Thomas is alive and that I can find him, then I will walk into Whitechapel at midnight and face whatever awaits me there. The Duke studied me for a long moment, and I saw something change in the way he looked at me. It was as though he was seeing me clearly for the first time, not as the sister of the man he had wronged, but as a person in my own right, a woman of courage and determination who would not be deterred by fear. Then we will go together, he said finally. His voice was quiet but firm. I will not let you face this alone. I wanted to refuse. I wanted to remind him that I did not trust him, that I had every reason to keep him at a distance. But the truth was that I did not want to face the darkness of Whitechapel by myself. And there was something else, something I did not want to admit even to myself. Despite everything, despite the horror of his confession and the weight of his guilt, I felt safer in his presence than I had felt in years. "Very well," I said. "Tonight, then." The Duke nodded. "I will send a carriage for you at midnight. Dress plainly, and tell no one where you are going." I thought of my uncle's house, of the watchful servants and the locked doors, of the 1,000 ways my absence might be discovered. How will I explain my absence if I am missed? Something shifted in the Duke's expression, a softening that caught me off guard. "I will handle that. I have means of ensuring that your absence goes unnoticed." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was lower, more intimate. "Miss Ashford, I know you have no reason to trust me. I know that everything I have told you should make you despise me. But I swear to you, on whatever honor I have left, that I will do everything in my power to help you find your brother. Not because it will absolve me of my sins, but because it is the right thing to do." I looked into his eyes, searching for deception, for hidden motives, for any sign that his words were merely manipulation. But all I found was a raw and painful sincerity that made something tighten in my chest. "I believe you," I said softly, and I surprised myself by meaning it. We stood there for a moment, the air between us charged with something unspoken. I was aware of how close he was standing, aware of the way his gaze moved over my face as though memorizing my features. I should have stepped back. I should have maintained the proper distance between us. Instead, I remained where I was, caught in a current I could not name. It was the Duke who finally broke the spell. He cleared his throat and moved away, shuffling papers on his desk with hands that were not quite steady. "My carriage will return you to your uncle's house," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Be ready at midnight." I left without another word, carrying the folder of documents beneath my cloak, my mind whirling with everything I had learned. As the carriage bore me back through the streets of London, I pressed my hand against the place where the petition rested against my heart. Thomas's signature, Thomas's promise. Somewhere in this city, my brother waited, and tonight I would take the first step toward finding him. But even as I thought of Thomas, another face kept intruding on my thoughts. Dark eyes filled with guilt and longing, a voice that spoke of love and loss with equal measures of pain. The Duke of Ravensford, my unlikely ally, my potential enemy, the man who had destroyed my brother and who now offered to help me save him. I did not know what to make of the feelings stirring within me. I only knew that when I thought of seeing him again at midnight, something quickened in my pulse that had nothing to do with fear. The carriage delivered me to my uncle's house just as the afternoon light was fading. I slipped inside unnoticed, returned to my room, and began to prepare for the night ahead. But as I laid out my plainest clothes and counted the hours until midnight, I could not shake the feeling that I was stepping onto a path from which there would be no return. Whatever waited for me in Whitechapel, whatever secrets Dr. Thorne guarded in his laboratory of blue lights, I would face them. And beside me would walk a man whose presence had already begun to change something fundamental within me, though I was not yet ready to name what that change might be. The clock on my mantel ticked steadily toward midnight, and I sat in the gathering darkness, waiting for my fate to find me. The Duke collapsed at the chapel door after seeing who signed her marriage. Petition. Chapter 4. Midnight came wrapped in fog and silence. I waited by my window, watching the street below, my heart beating a rhythm of anticipation and dread. When the black carriage appeared at the corner, moving without lanterns through the darkness, I gathered my cloak around me and slipped from my room like a shadow escaping the light. The Duke was waiting inside the carriage. He had changed from his earlier formal attire into something darker, more practical, the clothes of a man expecting trouble. When I settled onto the seat across from him, he studied me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. "You came," he said. "Did you expect me to change my mind?" A faint smile crossed his features, there and gone in an instant. I have learned to expect nothing, Miss Ashford. It makes the rare, pleasant surprises all the more meaningful. The carriage lurched into motion, carrying us away from the respectable streets of Mayfair and into the winding arteries of a city that wore a different face after dark. Through the window, I watched the buildings grow older, more cramped, their facades stained with decades of soot and poverty. The gas lamps became fewer and farther between, and the fog thickened until the world beyond the glass was nothing but a gray void punctuated by occasional flickers of light. "Tell me what to expect," I said. The Duke leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his expression grave. The building in question appears abandoned from the outside. Boarded windows, a door that looks as though it has not been opened in years. But my investigator reported seeing people entering through a passage in the adjacent alley. If Dr. Thorne is truly operating there, he will have measures in place to prevent unwanted intrusion. And if we encounter such measures, then we proceed with caution. I did not survive 5 years of searching for your brother by being reckless. I thought of the Duke's confession, of the night in the laboratory when his recklessness had destroyed Thomas's hands. I wondered if he was thinking of it too, if every step of this journey was shadowed by the memory of what his impulsiveness had cost. The carriage stopped at the edge of Whitechapel, in a narrow lane between a shuttered public house and a tenement that sagged against its neighbor like a drunkard. The Duke helped me down, his gloved hand warm around mine, and for a moment we stood in the darkness, our breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. "Stay close to me," he said softly, "and if I tell you to run, do not hesitate." We moved through the lanes of Whitechapel like ghosts, our footsteps muffled by the fog. The streets were not empty even at this hour. Figures huddled in doorways, watching us pass with eyes that gleamed in the darkness. Somewhere nearby, a woman laughed, the sound high and desperate, and a child cried out before being quickly silenced. This was a world far removed from the ballrooms and drawing rooms of my previous life, a world where survival was measured in coins and cruelty. The building we sought stood at the end of a cramped alley, exactly as the sketch had depicted. It was 3 stories tall, its windows dark and boarded, its door sealed with planks that had weathered to gray. But as we approached, I noticed what the Duke's investigator must have seen. A thin line of blue light, barely visible, seeping through the cracks at the edges of the uppermost window. "There," I whispered, pointing. The Duke nodded. He led me around the side of the building, into a passage so narrow that we had to press ourselves against the damp brickwork to pass through. At the far end, half hidden behind a pile of refuse, was a door. It looked as derelict as the rest of the building, but when the Duke pressed his palm against it, it swung inward without a sound. We stepped inside and found ourselves in complete darkness. The Duke struck a match, and in its brief flare I glimpsed a staircase leading upward, its treads worn smooth by countless footsteps. We climbed in silence, the match dying between the Duke's fingers, plunging us back into blackness. But ahead, I could see it now more clearly, that strange blue glow, filtering down from above like moonlight through water. The staircase ended at a landing, and beyond the landing was a door that stood slightly ajar. The blue light spilled through the gap, painting the walls with an ethereal radiance. The Duke reached for my hand, and I did not pull away. Together we pushed the door open and stepped into Dr. Erasmus Thorne's laboratory. I do not know what I expected. Something from a Gothic novel, perhaps, all bubbling beakers and sparking apparatus. What I found was simultaneously more mundane and more terrifying. The room was large and cluttered, filled with tables covered in papers and devices I could not identify. But dominating the center of the space was a machine unlike anything I had ever seen. It was constructed of brass and glass and something that looked almost organic, tubes and wires connecting a central chamber to a series of smaller vessels arranged in a semicircle. The blue light emanated from within the central chamber, pulsing gently like a heartbeat. And inside that chamber, suspended in a luminous fluid, was something that made my blood run cold. a brain, a human brain, perfectly preserved, floating in that unearthly glow. I heard myself gasp, felt the Duke's hand tighten around mine. But before either of us could speak, a voice emerged from the shadows at the far end of the room. I wondered how long it would take you to find me. A figure stepped into the light, and I found myself face to face with Dr. Erasmus Thorne. He was older than I had imagined, his hair white and wild, his eyes burning with an intelligence that bordered on madness. He wore a laboratory coat stained with substances I did not want to identify, and his hands, long and delicate, were clasped before him as though in prayer. "Dr. Thorne," the Duke said. His voice was steady, but I could feel the tension vibrating through his body. "Where is Thomas Ashford?" The doctor's gaze moved from the Duke to me, and something shifted in his expression. "You must be the sister." "Yes, I see the resemblance. Thomas spoke of you often in the early days, before he became too absorbed in the work to speak of anything else." "Is he alive?" I demanded. The words came out sharper than I intended. "Is my brother alive?" Dr. Thorne smiled, and it was the most unsettling thing I had ever seen. "That depends on how you define alive, Miss Ashford. His body ceased to function 3 years ago. An infection in the wounds to his hands that proved resistant to all treatment. He died in my arms, speaking your name. The world tilted around me. I would have fallen if the Duke had not caught me, his arm wrapping around my waist, holding me upright when my legs could no longer support me. 3 years. Thomas had been dead for 3 years, and I had continued to search, to hope, to believe that someday I would see his face again. Then who signed the petition? The Duke's voice cut through the fog of my grief. If Thomas has been dead for 3 years, who wrote that signature? Dr. Thorne's smile widened. He turned and gestured toward the machine, toward the brain floating in its chamber of blue light. Thomas did, of course. Or rather, what remains of Thomas. Before he died, I extracted the essence of his consciousness and preserved it here. His memories, his personality, his very soul, if you believe in such things. He exists now as pure thought, freed from the limitations of a physical form. I stared at the doctor, unable to process what he was saying. "You are telling me that my brother's mind is inside that machine? Not just his mind. Everything that made him who he was. I have been refining the process for years, but Thomas was my first complete success. He can see through lenses I have positioned around the city. He can hear through microphones I have installed in key locations. And through a device I call the transcriptor, he can write. He concentrated on forming the words, and the machine translated his thoughts directly onto paper. "The petition," I whispered. "Thomas wrote the petition." "He has been watching over you, Miss Ashford. Even after death, he refused to abandon his sister. When he learned of your engagement to Viscount Hartley, he begged me to intervene. The petition was his idea. He wanted to give you a means of escape." Tears were streaming down my face now, hot and relentless. I did not try to stop them. Thomas had been dead for 3 years, and yet he had still found a way to protect me. Even reduced to pure consciousness, trapped in a machine of brass and glass, he had kept his promise. But the Duke was not weeping. The Duke was staring at Dr. Thorne with an expression of dawning horror. "Why bring us here?" he asked. If Thomas wanted to help his sister, he could have done so without revealing any of this. Why orchestrate this elaborate charade? Dr. Thorne's smile faded. "Because Thomas is not the only one who wanted something from this meeting, Your Grace. I have been watching you as well. I know what you did that night in my laboratory. I know that your jealousy and your violence robbed the world of one of its most brilliant minds. And now I intend to extract payment." Before either of us could react, figures emerged from the shadows around us. Men in dark clothes, their faces covered, their hands holding weapons that gleamed in the blue light. The Duke pulled me behind him, but we were surrounded, outnumbered, with nowhere to run. "What do you want?" the Duke demanded. Dr. Thorne walked slowly toward us, his eyes fixed on the Duke's face. "I want what Thomas wanted. I want justice. You destroyed his hands, destroyed his ability to continue his work, and now you will take his place. Your consciousness will be extracted and preserved, and you will spend eternity as Thomas has, a mind without a body, aware but unable to act." "You are insane," the Duke said. "Perhaps, but I am also the only one who can decide your fate." The doctor stopped a few feet away, close enough that I could see the network of wrinkles on his face, the yellowed teeth behind his thin lips. Unless, of course, Miss Ashford would prefer to negotiate. I stepped out from behind the Duke, my heart pounding, but my voice steady. What kind of negotiation? Dr. Thorne's gaze moved over me with clinical interest. "Thomas has been conscious for 3 years, Miss Ashford. 3 years of watching, listening, thinking, unable to touch or taste or feel. He is lonely beyond measure. He has asked me to find him a companion." "No." The Duke's voice was sharp, desperate. "Whatever you are proposing, I will not allow it." But the doctor ignored him, his attention focused entirely on me. "I could transfer your consciousness as well, Miss Ashford. You and Thomas could be together, 2 minds in perfect communion, free from the constraints of physical existence. You would never age, never sicken, never die. You would simply be together, forever." I looked at the machine, at the brain floating in its chamber of light. Somewhere in that tangle of preserved tissue, my brother still existed, still thought, still remembered, still loved me. The offer was monstrous. It was also, in its own twisted way, beautiful. Eliza. The Duke's voice was raw, stripped of all pretense. "Do not consider this. Whatever happens to me, you must not sacrifice yourself." I turned to look at him. At this man who had confessed to destroying my brother, who had spent 5 years trying to atone for his sins. His eyes were wide with fear, not for himself, but for me. And I realized in that moment that somewhere in the course of this strange and terrible night, something had changed between us. The hatred I had expected to feel had transformed into something far more complicated, far more dangerous. "I am not going to sacrifice myself," I said, "but I am not going to let you sacrifice yourself either." I turned back to Dr. Thorne, and I spoke the words that would determine all our fates. "I want to speak to Thomas. If he is truly conscious in that machine, if he can truly communicate, then let him tell me himself what he wants." The doctor studied me for a long moment, and then he nodded. "Very well. But be warned, Miss Ashford. What you hear may not be what you expect." He crossed to a device near the machine and made several adjustments. The blue light intensified, and then, impossibly, a voice emerged from the apparatus. A voice I had not heard in 5 years, a voice I had never thought to hear again. "Eliza, my dear, brave Eliza, I have missed you so terribly." "Thomas," I whispered, and the tears began to fall again. Not from grief this time, but from a joy so profound it was indistinguishable from pain. But as I listened to my brother's voice, as I heard him speak of his years in the machine, of the loneliness and the longing and the desperate desire for companionship, I began to understand that this was not the reunion I had dreamed of. Thomas was alive, yes, but he was also something other than human, something that had been shaped by 3 years of isolation into a creature I barely recognized. And when he told me what he truly wanted, what he had been planning all along, I realized that the choice before me was not between life and death, but between 2 different kinds of destruction. The blue light pulsed around us, and somewhere in the depths of the machine, my brother waited for my answer. The Duke collapsed at the chapel door, after seeing who signed her marriage petition. Chapter 5. Thomas's voice filled the laboratory like a ghost made of sound, familiar and yet fundamentally altered by whatever transformation he had undergone. I stood before the machine that contained what remained of my brother. tears drying on my cheeks, and I listened as he told me the truth I had been seeking for 5 years. I never intended to marry him, Eliza. The words emerged from the apparatus with perfect clarity. The Duke was a means to an end, a connection to wealth and influence that would allow me to fund Dr. Thorne's research. I knew from the beginning that I would never go through with the wedding. I simply needed his resources long enough to complete the first phase of the work. I felt the Duke stiffen beside me. His face had gone pale, but he did not speak. He simply listened, as I did, to the confession of the man he had loved. The night before the ceremony, I planned to disappear. I had already made arrangements to fake my death, to assume a new identity, to continue working with Dr. Thorne in secret. But Adrian followed me to the laboratory. He saw things he was not meant to see. And when he grabbed my hands, when he tried to pull me away from the transcriptor, the machine activated prematurely. The extraction process began before I was prepared. "Your hands," I whispered. The Duke said the machine destroyed your hands. The machine was designed to extract consciousness through physical contact, Thomas explained. When it activated while my hands were still in the interface, it pulled too much, too fast. The flesh was burned away as the neural connections were severed. Dr. Thorne managed to stop the process before it killed me, but the damage was done. I could never write again, never perform the delicate work the research required. I became useless. I thought of my brother, brilliant and ambitious, reduced to helplessness by a moment of violence. I thought of him spending years in Dr. Thorne's care, watching his body fail while his mind remained sharp. And I thought of the Duke, carrying the guilt of that destruction, never knowing that Thomas had intended to betray him from the very beginning. The infection came 3 years later, Thomas continued. By then, I had made my peace with what was to come. I asked Dr. Thorne to complete the extraction, to preserve my consciousness in the machine rather than let it die with my body. And he agreed. "Why?" I asked. "Why would you choose this existence over death?" "Because I was not finished." There was cold certainty in his voice now, something hard and unyielding that I did not recognize. I had spent years planning my revenge against the Duke of Ravensford, and I was not willing to let a simple thing like death prevent me from seeing it through. The Duke stepped forward, his hands clenched at his sides. "Your revenge? I destroyed your hands by accident, in a moment of jealous rage that I have regretted every day since. I have spent 5 years trying to find you, to atone for what I did. And all this time, you were planning revenge? You took everything from me." Thomas's voice had grown louder, more intense. "My hands, my work, my future. You condemned me to years of suffering because you could not control your emotions. And now, you will suffer as I have suffered. Dr. Thorne will extract your consciousness, and you will spend eternity in this machine, aware but powerless, watching the world move on without you." I looked at the men surrounding us, at their weapons glinting in the blue light, at Dr. Thorne watching the scene with clinical fascination. This was what Thomas had planned all along. The petition, the chapel, the trail of clues that had led us here. It had all been designed to deliver the Duke into his hands. "Thomas," I said, and my voice surprised me with its steadiness. "This is not who you are. You do not know who I am, Eliza. You knew the brother who protected you, who sheltered you from the harsh realities of the world. But that man was always playing a role. The real Thomas Ashford was ambitious, ruthless, willing to do whatever was necessary to achieve his goals. I manipulated the Duke from the moment we met. I would have destroyed his reputation, taken his fortune, left him with nothing. The only thing that went wrong was the timing. I stared at the machine, at the brain floating in its chamber of light, and I tried to reconcile what I was hearing with the brother I remembered, the gentle man who had comforted me after our parents died, the patient guardian who had taught me to navigate society's treacherous waters. Had all of that been a mask? Had I ever known him at all? But even as I asked myself these questions, I noticed something that did not fit. Thomas's voice, for all its coldness, carried an undertone of something else, something that sounded almost like desperation. "You wanted me here," I said slowly. "You could have destroyed the Duke without involving me at all. But you brought me into this. You gave me the petition. You made sure I would be standing here, in this room, at this moment. Why?" The machine was silent for a long moment. When Thomas spoke again, his voice had changed, the hardness cracking to reveal something raw beneath. "Because I needed to see you one more time. Because despite everything I have become, despite the hatred that has sustained me for 5 years, I could not leave this world without saying goodbye to my sister." I felt tears prick my eyes again, but I did not let them fall. "You do not have to do this, Thomas. Whatever the Duke did, whatever you have suffered, this will not bring you peace. It will only deepen the darkness that has consumed you. You do not understand. Then help me understand." I stepped closer to the machine, close enough that the blue light washed over my face like cold water. "Tell me what you really want. Not revenge, not justice. What does Thomas Ashford, stripped of everything else, truly desire?" The silence stretched between us, filled only by the soft hum of the machinery and the steady pulse of that unearthly glow. When my brother spoke again, his voice was barely a whisper. "I want to rest. I want the pain to end. I have been conscious in this machine for 3 years, Eliza. 3 years of thinking, remembering, feeling everything with perfect clarity and being unable to act on any of it. The hatred was the only thing that kept me sane. Without it, I am nothing but an empty vessel longing for oblivion." I pressed my hand against the glass of the chamber, and I could have sworn I felt something press back, a presence reaching out from within the light. "Then let me give you that rest," I said. "Let the Duke go. Let Dr. Thorne's men stand down. And I will find a way to end your suffering, not through revenge, but through mercy." "Miss Ashford." Dr. Thorne's voice cut through the moment. "I must advise against this course of action. Thomas's consciousness is the culmination of my life's work. I cannot simply allow it to be destroyed." I turned to face the doctor, and I felt something ignite within me, a fury that had been building since the moment I learned the truth about my brother's fate. "Your life's work has been the destruction of everything it touched," I said. "You took a brilliant man and turned him into a prisoner of his own mind. You offered him immortality and gave him eternal torment. Whatever contribution you believe you have made to science, it does not outweigh the suffering you have caused." Dr. Thorne's expression hardened. "You are young and naive, Miss Ashford. You do not understand the importance of what we have achieved here. I understand enough." I looked around the laboratory at the machines and the papers and the brain floating in its chamber of light. "I understand that my brother is in pain, and that you are the cause of that pain. And I understand that if you do not let him go, I will find a way to destroy everything you have built." The doctor laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the walls. "And how do you propose to do that? You are surrounded by my men, unarmed, helpless. She is not helpless." The Duke's voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that silenced the room. He stepped forward, positioning himself between me and Dr. Thorne, and when he spoke again, his words were addressed to Thomas. "I loved you. You know that. Whatever your feelings were for me, whatever role you were playing, my love was real. And when I destroyed your hands, I destroyed myself as well. I have spent 5 years in a prison of my own making, tortured by guilt, unable to forgive myself for what I did." He paused, drawing a shaky breath. "If taking my consciousness will bring you peace, then do it. I will not resist. But first, let your sister go. She has no part in what happened between us. She deserves to live her life free of this darkness." "Adrian, no." I grabbed his arm. but he shook me off. "This is my choice, Eliza." His eyes met mine, and I saw in them a depth of feeling that stole my breath. I have done terrible things. I have caused immeasurable suffering. If there is any way for me to make amends, this is it. I stared at him, at this man who had confessed to destroying my brother, who had carried the weight of that guilt for 5 years, who was now offering to sacrifice himself for my freedom. And I realized, with a certainty that settled into my bones like warmth after a long winter, that I could not let him do it. "Thomas," I said, turning back to the machine, "you once told me that the truest measure of a person is not what they do when the world is watching, but what they do when they believe no one can see. The Duke has shown you his heart. He is willing to give up everything for me, a woman he has known for less than a day. Is that the act of a monster?" The machine was silent. "You have spent 5 years nursing your hatred," I continued, "but hatred is a poison that destroys the vessel that contains it. If you go through with this, you will not find peace. You will only find more emptiness, more pain, more endless consciousness with nothing to sustain it. Is that truly what you want?" When Thomas spoke again, his voice was broken, stripped of all pretense. "I do not know what I want anymore. I do not know who I am. The man I was before the accident, the man I became after, the thing I am now. They are all strangers to me. Then let me help you find out. Let me stay with you, talk to you, remind you of who you were before all of this. And when you are ready, when you have made peace with your life and your choices, I will help you find the rest you deserve." The blue light in the chamber flickered, and I heard something that might have been a sob emerging from the apparatus. "You would do that for me? After everything I have told you, everything I have done? You are my brother." I pressed my hand harder against the glass. "Nothing you have said has changed that. Nothing ever could." The silence that followed was the longest of my life. I stood there, my hand against the cold glass, my heart beating against my ribs, waiting for my brother to decide all our fates. And then, finally, Thomas spoke. "Dr. Thorne, stand down your men. Let the Duke and my sister leave unharmed." The doctor sputtered in protest, but Thomas cut him off. "You have been well compensated for your work. You will continue to receive funding from the accounts I have established. But this ends now. I will not have more blood on my hands, not even his." The men in dark clothes exchanged uncertain glances. Dr. Thorne's face had gone red with fury. But there was something in Thomas's voice, some remnant of the commanding presence he had possessed in life, that brooked no argument. One by one the men lowered their weapons and stepped back. "Go," Thomas said, "both of you, and Adrian." The Duke turned toward the machine, his expression unreadable. "I forgive you." The words hung in the air like a benediction. "For the deception, for the manipulation, for all of it, I forgive you." Another silence. And then, so softly I almost missed it, my brother's voice emerged one final time. "Thank you." The Duke took my hand, and together we walked out of the laboratory, down the stairs, through the narrow passage, and into the streets of Whitechapel. The fog had begun to lift, and the first gray light of dawn was seeping over the rooftops. We stood there in the cold morning air, breathing deeply, alive in a way that felt almost miraculous after everything we had endured. "What happens now?" I asked. The Duke looked down at me, and something in his expression made my heart skip. "Now, I help you. The petition your brother signed is still valid. We can use it to free you from your uncle's control, to void your engagement to Viscount Hartley. And then, he raised my hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss against my knuckles. And then, Miss Ashford, I would very much like the opportunity to court you properly, if you would permit such a thing from a man with my history." I thought of everything I had learned about him, the violence and the guilt and the years of suffering. I thought of the way he had looked at me in that laboratory, ready to sacrifice himself for my freedom. And I thought of the strange, impossible connection that had formed between us in the span of a single night, a bond forged in shared grief and desperate hope. "I think," I said slowly, "that I would like that very much." The Duke smiled, and it transformed his face, chasing away the shadows that had haunted his features since the moment I first saw him. "Then let us begin again, Miss Ashford. From this moment forward." He offered me his arm, and I took it, and together we walked through the waking streets of London as the sun rose over a city that suddenly seemed full of possibility. In the weeks that followed, much changed. The petition was filed with the church, and my uncle's contract with Viscount Hartley was declared void. When Lord Bertram attempted to contest the decision, the Duke's solicitors produced evidence of financial improprieties that silenced his objections permanently. I was free, truly free, for the first time in my adult life. I visited Thomas every week, sitting beside his machine, talking to him about the world beyond the laboratory walls. Slowly, painfully, my brother began to emerge from the darkness that had consumed him. He spoke of our parents, of our childhood, of the dreams he had once held before ambition twisted them into something unrecognizable. And one evening, as the autumn leaves began to fall outside the laboratory windows, he told me he was ready. Dr. Thorne performed the procedure that disconnected Thomas's consciousness from the machine. I held my hand against the glass as the blue light faded, as my brother's presence gently dissolved into the peace he had sought for so long. His last words were my name, spoken with a tenderness I had feared I would never hear again. I wept, but they were not entirely tears of grief. They were also tears of release, of gratitude, of love that had survived even the darkest of transformations. The Duke was waiting for me outside the laboratory, as he had waited every week since that first night. He did not speak. He simply opened his arms, and I walked into his embrace, and for the first time in 5 years, I felt truly safe. We married in the spring, in a small chapel far from London, with only a handful of witnesses present. The ceremony was simple, the vows sincere, the kiss that sealed our union a promise of all the years to come. As we walked out into the sunlight, hand in hand, I thought of Thomas, of the brother I had loved and lost and found and lost again. I thought of the petition that had started everything, the signature that should have been impossible, the message from beyond death that had set me on the path to this moment. And I understood at last that even the darkest stories can have endings filled with light, that even the most broken people can find redemption, that love, in all its complicated, painful, beautiful forms, is the only force strong enough to conquer the shadows that haunt us. My name is Eliza Vane, Duchess of Ravensford. I have known loss and grief and betrayal. I have walked through fog and darkness and emerged on the other side. And now, with my husband beside me and the rest of my life stretching out before me like an unwritten page, I am finally ready to begin again. This is my story, and it ends, as all the best stories do, with hope.